Welcome to Implement This with Microsoft Business Solutions MVP Britta Rexstead and co-host Matthew C. Anderson, where we have an insider's discussion around the things we consider when implementing Dynamics 365. In today's episode, sponsored by CRM-UG, Britta and I discuss data modeling in Dynamics 365. The user group community for Dynamics 365 and CRM, D365UG, CRM-UG, is powered by users for users and specializes in the delivery of member-driven education, networking, and events to help you maximize your current Microsoft Dynamics investment. D365UG is the world's most influential user group community of Microsoft Dynamics 365 and CRM users and partners. Across the globe, members share a common goal of maximizing and advancing the performance of Microsoft Dynamics 365 and CRM so that individuals and companies can improve operations, overcome obstacles, and exceed goals. We thank CRM-UG for their sponsorship, and now, on with the show. And now we're back for another episode of Implement This. Hi, Britta. How are you?
Good, Matt. How are you doing?
I am doing very well. I'm feeling dynamic today.
Well, good. You're in the right place then. So what I'd love to get into today is data modeling, something I've been spending time in the last week working on all systems that I did not build, which is always interesting when you come in and the data is modeled in a particular way and you're trying to grow that design, but you didn't start off. And so it always brings to mind things that maybe best practices I didn't know when I first got started, things that were not obvious, or maybe where my instinct was wrong. And then I think it'd just be a great conversation since you and I have done so much data modeling. Yeah. I think there's a lot of insight that we can share with your average system admin or customizer or someone who's starting to toe in the water of bringing in extra custom data into their system, what the right way to go about that is.
Yeah, and so I like that, and specifically modeling against the Dynamics data model, and not necessarily the much broader topic that I would hardly consider myself qualified to talk about of like all of the different aspects of business intelligence and analytics type of data modeling. So kind of confining it within Dynamics.
Yes. Yep. Okay. Something that a system admin would do if they had systems administrator security role. And let's stay very much inside the Dynamics box today. Okay. Not get too far out there. So the first thing that I think we need to make sure we cover is that you shouldn't just cave to temptation and repurpose an entity you don't think you'll ever use. That one's so painful. I just hear so many horror stories. I don't know if it was dumb luck. I didn't do that when I was a newbie, but I very easily could have, and I meet so many people who did. I think that's pretty common. The thought is, well, we're never going to use cases because we don't have customer service, so we're just going to make this into something else. Or we don't have leads, but I really need something, so I'm just going to turn leads into something else. And that happens all the time. And it's really hard to justify, I think, once you know what you're doing, because it is so easy to make a custom entity. And once you bring in, just with upgrades, sometimes there's functionality that comes in later, or the business changes, or you install an ISV solution, and all of a sudden you are using entities that you didn't care about before. Yeah. There are some that I still think I'm never going to use. I don't think I'm going to track letters in CRM. I don't think I'm going to track faxes in CRM. So there's some that I know better than to steal them and use them for something else. My one exception to that is cases. I do steal cases just because I like that functionality. I like being able to nest my activities inside of something. But other than that, I really, really try not to steal an existing entity for something totally different. Try to make custom.
Yeah, I don't even steal cases.
You don't steal cases? I'm kind of a sucker for cases. I love all of the customer service functionality. There's just some cool things over there. But I cringe when I do it, and then I explain to all the consultants around me that we don't steal entities. Shh. And then I steal cases. So it's not a habit that I like to teach people to do.
Yeah. So I mean, along the lines of this, I want to give a little bit of context of kind of some of the when and why it might be so tempting, because I have been there. And it's definitely around, there's a time when you're going through an implementation, whether it's the initial implementation or just expanding the functionality you're using, and there's a need for tracking some new type of information, and you want to do a fit gap and say, hey, if there's something already in here that I can use and it's a good enough fit, should I just use that? And inevitably what happens is, at least in my case, and some people I've compared war stories on with this, is that, yeah, it starts off seeming like, well, we could stretch this. It's a little bit of
if you squint, it almost looks like it.
Yeah, and, there's this one really cool piece of functionality that's already in there that, gosh, that feels like it'd take some work to be able to rebuild it. And, sure, it wasn't really meant for that, but to your point, we'll never use leads anyway. So let's just go ahead and take that one over. And on a surface level, and maybe for some implementations you can do that and get away with it, but more often than not, I've seen that you come back later and you say, oh, why did we commandeer this one? And part of the rationale behind the frustration later on is that you don't necessarily see everything that's coming along with it under the hood when you use an existing entity. There are things that happen behind the scenes that are helpful in many cases, but can work against you in many cases. Here's an example is on the opportunity products entity. That was one where trying to track some related information, more granular details about an opportunity. Oh, we'll just use the opportunity products entity. Well, at a surface level, seems like a really good idea. And, back at the time, and this was, pressing almost 10 years ago at this point, we said, yeah, let's do that. And sure, we were able to get the information we wanted. It was already related to the opportunity, so we weren't creating a custom entity. It felt like we weren't, quote unquote, going very custom with it. But what we didn't count on was some of the baked in hooks between opportunity and opportunity product, because those two out of the box expect that you're using them like products for the opportunity. And there's a hook into sales orders. There's a hook into invoices from those opportunity products. And we wanted to use sales orders associated with opportunities a little bit later in our implementation. But we'd already commandeered opportunity products. And when we created sales orders and we brought in opportunity products, all of a sudden we had all this extra stuff from the opportunity products that we didn't really want in those sales orders, because the sales order data was coming in as part of an integration from an ERP, which makes total sense. Yes, you want it to do that, but now there was this contention of information that was coming there. So what seemed like this really innocuous way to, very, very, very straightforward way to get additional information about opportunities, we weren't going to use opportunity products, well, came back to bite us.
Mm-hmm. It can also hit you in other areas now. We've got all the platform is getting so strong. Like you can deploy Power BI by just hitting one of the service, there's packs that already write all the charts for you. And so they pull together charts you probably want for leads and for opportunities and for all those things. Mm-hmm. And you never know if you steal it, what sneaky thing is going to pop up on the wrong side of Power BI and look dumb. There's just things you don't know what you don't know. And it's so easy to make a custom entity that's really, really hard to justify not just making a new one.
Yeah.
The difference there, where I would separate that thought, is that accounts and contacts, you're always going to have accounts and contacts, and you will always need accounts and contacts. So in data modeling, to me, accounts are always groups of people and or organizations that do things. And contacts are people. So if you have a pulse, you are a contact. And that is always, and then from there I just get into types. I see a lot of times where people, they might say, well, I have 3 different kinds of people that I pay attention to, so I'm going to use contacts and then 2 custom entities. You don't want to do that.
Yeah.
There's so many baked in behind the scenes things with accounts and contacts that I'd strongly discourage creating custom entities that are also for people or also for organizations. Have a type, have an account, have a contact type. So you have, patients as a type and doctors as a type and pharmaceutical sales reps as a type, but don't make a pharmaceutical sales reps entity or don't make a nonprofits entity and a for-profits entity. They're just all accounts.
Yeah, and I mean the temptation is there. I'm so glad you brought this up because those organization types or contact types are a great example. And if you do find yourself in a situation where you want to be able to have kind of that entity record, make it an intersect entity where I have my pharmaceutical sales rep entity, but it's really just a look up to a contacts, and maybe I have a quick view form that shows the contact's information, but you're not, like, if it's a person, it should be a contact.
Yep.
And, if you're capturing that additional information of, contact types, sure, consider using something like an intersect entity between the types and the person record themselves. And the same is true for organizations that you're putting in there from an account perspective.
Mm-hmm. You just run into so many things down the road, like email templates. Email templates, the dynamic ones, are for accounts, contacts, and leads. So if some of your people are in custom entities, you're not going to be able to send them an email template. So you got to be really careful there. So assuming that we're not talking about people and we're not talking about groups, let's talk about other kinds of data that we bring in, and we need to make some decisions about those kinds of data. So one thing that I think about when I'm data modeling is how the data will get there. And so this I learned because the earliest things I data modeled when I had no idea what I was doing were for financial imports. So I worked in financial services. We had all these imports of data that came in on a daily basis where we were doing things like updating account values or, reflecting changes in the stock market, or other things like that. So we did a lot of imports, a lot of bringing in data.
Okay.
And something I learned really early is that if your data coming in, you don't have so much control over the formatting. You just want to be really aware of the kind of field that it's landing in. And so, like, for example, we were first trying to bring data imports into decimal fields.
Okay.
Because that seemed to make sense. But what I found is that if I said I needed 2 decimal places, I had to, in all cases, provide that information. And that got really squirrely on me. And so we ended up moving, for the import process, into floating point numbers. Because then, because my data, I didn't have so much control over it. Now you can do some things with rounding, and it depends how much formatting you want to do.
Yep.
But you do want to think about how the data is coming in. We do see text fields used, all the time for that kind of thing. If it's coming in import, you just want to think about there's so many choices in number fields that whether that data is getting populated by an integration or by a person or from a mobile app or something else, just think about how the data will actually get in the field before you pick the field type.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you go back later and end up changing it out.
Yeah, and I mean, generally things like, if it is a number, try to use one of the number type fields. I mean, yes, you can physically put it in a text field, and yes, it will technically work, but you're giving up a lot of functionality when you do that. You can't do a roll up on a text field and have it do anything for you. Or, if it is a dollar value of some sort, you probably want to use a currency field or the currency field type, because then if you find yourself, maybe not today, but in a future time where you need to change an exchange rate, or you're going to have multiple currencies within your implementation, you don't want to be pigeonholed where, we just put it in a floating point field, if it is really a dollar value. So there's some of those types of things that really make sense as far as trying to stick with a specific type. So yeah.
And unfortunately, that's something that you have to decide when you go make the field.
Yeah.
So you can decide some things later, like you can go in and change the minimum, maximum values. A lot of times I find myself making the minimum value 0, because by default you can go negative, and a lot of fields maybe shouldn't ever be allowed to go negative.
Sure.
So you can tinker with those after the fact, which is great, because sometimes your business needs change or your perception of a process changes once you get into it. But the actual field type itself you're stuck with.
Yep.
And so there's a nice tool, I can't remember the name of it, but we'll throw it in the show notes, in the XRM toolbox for replacing. Is that in number fields?
I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay.
There's a lot of things.
There are some tools for if you you had data in an old field and you need to move it over. Otherwise, I also have done that with workflows a lot, where you make the new field, you move all the data, kill the old field. to move things around. But you don't want to have to do that. You just want to be smart and build it right the first time, if you possibly can. So something I want to talk about, we've talked a lot on the show about how you need to be really careful and use global option sets if you possibly can. But I think sometimes in data modeling, global option sets sound like the default when really maybe it's a custom entity that you should use.
Okay.
So I want to talk about those conversations because that's something that if you're new to building out those relationships might not think about. It's something that you and I have to think about on the job all the time. What is a custom entity, maybe in a little subgrid, and then what is just an option set?
Yeah.
Do you have any rules that you use to help you gauge which direction to lean on that?
Yeah, so I do have a handful. So the first thing that comes to mind for me is for those values that are in there, who are the people that are going to be creating and maintaining those? Because if it's a global option set, you need to be a system customizer to be able to modify the values that are in there. On the other hand, if you have some other user type who's not a system customizer or system administrator, and you want them to be able to modify, update those values, then you probably want to consider having a lookup or a custom entity for those, so you can assign a specific security role that gives someone that permission. Do the users need to update those? Does, say, sales operations or service operations need to adjust those without having to go to a system administrator and through a change control process to be able to make that update? So that's the first one for me. How about for you?
I think I want to follow up on what you're talking about, the changes. There you want to balance. I just had a conversation with someone about this week, where just the fact that we want it easy to update doesn't necessarily mean it should be one or the other. Because if it is part of the business process and you need to do some business analysis on any changes, then making it easy to add things doesn't necessarily solve your problem. So I think the ease of adding is important for things that are very nuanced or ad hoc or just kind of flow and change quickly over time. But there is a temptation to say, well, we might change our mind on that option set. And it's like, well, that's actually easy enough to change. We'd still want to have some kind of due diligence around it. Where the first question I ask when I'm trying to decide if it's going to be a custom entity or an option set is, will everyone who looks at it see the same options? And so sometimes that's just fine. Everyone sees the same 5 options, but sometimes that list needs to be fairly nuanced. So sometimes it's a security thing where I may only get 3 options, but my boss gets 7.
Okay. Yeah.
Or it might be specific to my client or specific to my project or specific to something else where maybe my nonprofit projects only have these types of services that we provide, but my for-profit projects in, mechanical engineering, they would have a totally different set of options. But if I don't usually work in those and it's not that type of project, then I'm not going to see those options or something else.
Yeah.
We also see this in more controlled and regulated industries where there's something that like anything to do with healthcare or maybe finance or other things where for security reasons, different areas can't see other lists. So a global option set, you're stuck. Everyone sees the same thing when they look at the form. When you use security on a custom entity, you can really control who sees the records because they're picking a record.
Yep.
So there's some nice nuance you can add with the security there.
Yeah, and let's just caveat that without code. I mean, there are code-based ways if you're using an option set to filter those down. Same thing with dependent pick lists, between two. But a lot of times here we're focusing on things that you can do without code, kind of without going to that. So, changing gears on that a little bit. Another one of those questions in trying to answer this is, are all users of the system going to be using the same language? Because option sets give you the capability to have a different label for each different language that you have enabled in Dynamics. If you have a lookup, reference entity as a field, the values are going to be put in one language. It's not going to automatically translate it to French or Spanish or whatever that other language is. So if there is a multilingual requirement on those values that are going to be looked up, that's a place where having the pick list or option set may be a better approach.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And then, one other place to consider this is when you are in, we've talked in previous episodes around the value of using multiple environments and using solutions to move things from one environment to another. Option sets move very nicely.
Oh, so much
solution
better.
files. So they're solution aware, as we were talking about before, versus reference data of those values that go in there aren't solution aware. That is an extra step where that information has to be brought in through some sort of process. Now that can be scripted out through through a DevOps type of process,
like Kingsway Soft or Scribe or something like that.
Yeah, well, so there are multiple approaches to doing that. I mean, so it's not necessarily just an import of a list.
Yeah.
But there is more work and more consideration as you're going between environments when you're using an entity versus a straight up, option set or global option set.
Yep. In your customizations, that's going to have an impact too. So you can get around, for example, I've gotten around it in workflows before. Because if I'm just going to import the same list into my 5 environments, so I'm functionally creating the same records, but they have different GUIDs because they're not the same in all the environments. They just have the same labels. Then I can get around it a little bit. I've done this in workflows where I have unique IDs on everything, and the workflow is looking for the unique ID, not the record itself. So that can keep your workflows from breaking. That doesn't work well in business rules. It doesn't work well in some cases with business process flows or other things. So it depends on what automation you're using off of that field. So if it's an option set, it just cleanly, beautifully works everywhere if you made it global. If you didn't, go back and make it global. But if you use that operational data approach where you've got records that are part of that custom entity, you really have to factor that in. Otherwise, you'll be surprised how many places it breaks. Because really, it's everywhere that you refer to that. So everywhere, let's say your operational data here is types of financial accounts. Everywhere that you put 401k, and you just picked that, in a dashboard or in a workflow or in a business rule or somewhere else, there will be breakage unless you use some kind of tool. The last one I used was Kingsway. I didn't use it, but someone for me did Kingsway Soft and moved operational data that way. And then all my GUIDs matched and everything really did move cleanly. And there's sometimes you need that. It's worth that level of work, but there are times that it's not.
Yep.
And so just having an option set can save you a lot of time.
Yeah.
So how about reporting? Because that's something that comes up in data modeling a lot. We got to be thinking about reporting.
Yes, reporting.
So first things first, reporting on a text field is just a bad day. Don't do it. I hit a point, I was actually working from my mom's house at one point this week, and I put my head in my hands on my desk. She went, "What is it?" And I explained to her why you don't want to do reporting off of a text field. So my mom learned about that this week. So let's talk about it. So assuming that we all understand that, like for example, a type, like let's say a sale type or a project type or a phase or something like that, having that be a text field is just a really bad idea. That you lack that consistency. And so your data is always going to be messy and your reporting is always going to be a fight. So you're going to end up doing data integrity work ahead of every report instead of just having it be naturally maintained for you.
Yeah.
So that gets back into that same thing we were just talking about with option sets and custom entities. But what else do you bring into the conversation when you're thinking about reporting?
Yeah, so a few different things. And this is, very early, even in discovery and understanding how are people going to be using this information. Kind of stealing a little bit of what you were talking about before of like, don't use the straight up text field. But things like when you're going to be creating views for people and people want to be able to filter those views in a very Excel-like way, if you want them to be able to have that type of ease of use, focusing on things like an option set, as far as, that's going to be the thing that provides that very easy checkbox, simple, interface for them being able to choose which values they want to have. You can do a filter in a view based on a lookup entity, but it's just not as simple. It's not as straightforward. It doesn't give you the consolidated list to work from. You do literally have to go into an additional screen and choose the items that are going to be there. And sometimes that's great, because if you have a ton of values, the having checkboxes and 100 different checkboxes you might have to pick, well, that's not the best interface for it anyway. Maybe having the intermediate window where you can search and kind of narrow things down and specifically add the items you want, that can be a great way to do it. But it is, what's that user experience going to be? How much training are they going to realistically receive on this? Because that's one of those things where they might know how to use Excel, and it's very simple to do it in an Excel-like way, but there are some approaches you can take where you're not necessarily going to get that.
Yeah. I did think of one thing. So I'm not flip-flopping on my stance on text fields. I just need to clarify that. But I want to add a little bit of advice. There are times that you just have to have a text box. And in the times that I can stomach having a text box are really important in reporting is because something other than a human populates it. It's usually for me a workflow, because that's kind of my go-to, but there's other things that could populate it, and then it's read-only. So no one tampers with it. I do have times that I've relied on text fields that were locked down and auto-populated, and then the data is consistent. And then it is easier to make sure that your dashboards run cleanly, and you can have other views and things run in a very standardized way. So there are times for it. When you have a user type in, just type into a field, every time you do that, especially with the text field, just your data integrity is going to be a little squishy, and that makes reporting doesn't like it being that way. So yeah, a little piece there. So one last piece talking about making decisions on types of fields. Something that people tend to gravitate towards is that 2 option for a yes, no.
Yes.
And that can be nice. There's some nice things about yes, no. I love the checkbox for a user interface. Just really nice, obvious. Everyone knows what to do with the checkbox. Yep. And that doesn't always have to be a checkbox. Sometimes it's radio buttons and it's labeled well, and I like that. The problem with that is it's never going to be empty. And I feel like this gets lost on people when they're data modeling. A 2 option field is never empty. It is either yes or it is no. So you can't do things like in a business rule, require a field. You can't require a 2 option field. I mean, it'll let you. It's not going to do anything. Because if the answer is not yes, it is no. Yeah. So it looks like the checkbox, you can require that checkbox, but you're not really, because the fields already has no as the answer if it's not yes.
Well, and what's interesting about that is from like a business process flow and a field requirement standpoint, that is true. But when you, let's say you add that 2 option set to an existing entity, and you have 10,000 records that already exist for that entity type, they aren't automatically set to no. They aren't automatically set to yes. It's null. It's not yes or no. It is null.
Which really breaks your logic down.
It just creates confusion that's out there. So...
But then you can't do that intentionally. You can't utilize that, because sometimes you want a null. Sometimes it should be affirmatively yes or no. It shouldn't be assumed to be no until proven otherwise. Sometimes you need a blank. And so, it makes your process messy either way. So I always try to figure out, does this data need a yes, no, and null? Or is purely yes, no sufficient? And then making sure it's consistent, especially when you're coming and you're adding fields after you already have data in production. Yeah. Because whether it's needing that field to be populated on the yes, no, or wanting your default to kick in on an option set, either way, you want to take that new field on an old record piece into consideration, and then also what are you going to use it for. I find more and more when I ask the question well in business requirements gathering, there is a need for the null or a need for a blank, because you don't want to just assume that it's no.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's the simple thing. Well, if by default it's not checked, using the checkbox example, if it's, when you look at that record later, is it not checked because someone forgot to ask the question? Mm-hmm. Or is it not checked because, well, the answer is really no?
Yeah.
And it's really tough to make that call unless you are super rigid around process for that. And for that kind of thing, process usually falls down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. It's hard to get a good feel. And when you just have that at scale, you've got thousands of that record, really hard to pick up on the nuance.
Yep.
There. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm glad we circled back around to that one. I think, there are certainly some other topics around this, modeling of data inside of the Dynamics platform that we can dig into again. But as I take a look at the clock, we're hitting about that 30-minute mark here, so we should probably wrap it for today.
Time to wrap it up then. So I guess I'll throw that back out to our listeners. If there's something that is bugging you on data modeling, please find us on Twitter, let us know, and we'd love to talk more about data modeling in your specific question. So we'll have all the links to that in the show notes, but come find us if you need help figuring that out.
Sounds good. Have a good one, Britta.
Thanks, you too, Matt.
You've been listening to Implement This with Britta Rexted and Matthew C. Anderson. Do you have a business problem you'd like us to discuss on the show? Reach us through our website, implementthis.org, where you can also subscribe to the podcast. We're on Twitter, too. Britta is @MacGyverCRM, and I'm @MC Anderson. Thanks so much for listening.